Little things matter, don't they? If I was doing some reading about, I've heard this analogy before, and I wanted to do some more research on it. They talk about, maybe you've heard the picture of if a plane is off 1 degree, it's so many miles off its course, and apparently it's absolutely true. For if a plane takes off and it's 1 degree off of its where it wants to go, for every hour it flies, it's about a mile off. So a 5-hour flight means you're 5 hours off, 5 miles, of where you want to be. If I've flown to Australia a couple times from Los Angeles, and that's a 14-hour flight. So that would be about 14 miles off, which that's a long flight. I don't know how much gas those things carry, but 14 miles could make the difference between landing in water and landing on ground. That's a big deal. 1 degree. Maybe you are on Facebook and you find something funny that you want to share, but it's a little questionable, it's a little off, but you post it anyway, and it's no big deal until you're up for that job interview and they check your social media and they said, you posted something that we're not quite too sure about. And it makes a difference between getting the job or not. Little thing can make a difference. You could have the coolest computer, maybe something in the kitchen you like Jess loves her KitchenAid mixer because she loves to cook, and now she has to cook different. Maybe you have like a really nice big TV, but if it's not plugged in, a little detail, it's not going to work, right? Little things make the difference. There's a little thing in our lives that we don't usually pay attention to or monitor. It just sort of happens as we go through life. Yet it is something we do all the time. It's something that I think is the single biggest influence on our moods. It's something that affects how we see other people and our relationships. It's something that affects how natural it is, or isn't, for us to be on mission to deliberately live like Jesus at all times. And this thing is our thinking. It is something we are doing all the time. Some people call this your thought life. Maybe you want to think of it in terms of your thinking processes, because we're not just talking about the individual thoughts you may have, or the areas that you think about, but we're also talking about the way in which we think, the way, maybe even the why of what we think. We are going through a topical series right now called Love Me Do. And we're looking at currently some of the things that Jesus' disciples are now passing on, because Jesus had disciples, and now we want to see, well, what did they take away that they felt were important to pass on? And last week we looked at Peter and some passages from 2 Peter, and this week we're going to look at Paul and a little bit of a passage from Paul. And I think, to me, Paul's usually known as like one of the big theological heavies. There's so much theology in what he writes about that a lot of the really practical stuff gets overlooked. And he seems to focus on the thought life quite a bit more than we might realize. And so open up to Philippians 4. We're going to look at a few verses. Philippians, as some of you may know, is one of the prison epistles. And when I say it's a prison epistle, I don't mean that the Philippians were in prison. I mean that Paul was in prison writing to them. So Paul, in jail, not just jail, but prison, the dungeon, the Roman dungeons, was writing to believers, and he is encouraging them. Doesn't that sound backwards? Paul is in jail, and he is trying to encourage them on the outside. And these Philippians were going through a particularly difficult time in their church life. Yet they were also one of the most generous churches to support Paul's ministry. So he has a special connection to them. And when we get into chapter 4, he's in the process of beginning to wrap up some of these thoughts and some of these things. He has some sort of closing exhortations for them. So let's read through these verses, and then we'll go back through and kind of glean some things from them. Philippians 4, starting at verse 6. Paul says to them, to these suffering Christians, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. The things which you have learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. Now, I think it's right that a lot of times this passage is taught as one on prayer, but I think when you look at it in a little bit more context, you actually see that it's more about thought. It begins with a person's thought life, and the application of that is in prayer. So let's go back to the top of verse 6. Paul says, be anxious for nothing. Or you could say, be anxious about nothing. Be anxious about not one thing. Be anxious even about no one. This is an imperative command. It's be anxious, which is like, I don't want to be anxious about nothing. Oh, okay. In other words, don't worry. Jesus uses this word several times, most notably to me in Matthew 6, when he says, don't worry about your life. Don't be anxious about your life. And he goes on to say, this is sort of a paraphrase, but he says, what you eat, what you're going to drink, what you're going to wear, isn't life more than these things? And if God cares about you, isn't he going to provide for these things? He says, don't be anxious. Don't worry. Don't stress. Anxiousness is a bummer, huh? I think we've all experienced some form of anxiety, right? Now, I'm not talking about, the anxiety that sometimes, you're afraid of something. We have a fear or fight or flight reflex. That's fine. We need to be, if you're afraid of something, you need to run away from it like a bus coming down you on the freeway or the road, then move out of the way, please. But we're not talking about just fear. We're talking about anxiety. We're talking about anxiousness. We're talking about stress. And it's interesting to me, an interesting thing about this particular word, what's sort of built into it is this idea of division. Anxiousness divides our thinking, doesn't it? I don't know if you've ever thought about it. I hadn't until I was doing some of this research. But that's what anxiety does, doesn't it? It splits our attention. It divides our thinking, and it divides our thinking away from reality and into a false reality. That's what anxiety does. Anxiousness, turns into obsession. And that's a pretty strong word, but when you think about it, we just need to call things what they are. When you become so anxious about something, you actually become obsessed by it. Your attention is again divided from reality into a false reality. And what happens is that false reality begins to invade real reality. You begin to see the rest of your life through this, what is a false construct, whatever the thing is you're obsessed about. If it's about a person, if it's about a job, if it's about money, if it's whatever that thing is, this false construct that you have been feeding with your thoughts begins to affect the rest of your life. It begins to affect your relationships. It begins to affect your job. But it is a false reality. So how do we not be anxious about anything? How do we reverse? Maybe you're in an anxious process, or maybe it's a cyclical thing for you. Maybe you go through phases of being anxious and not. And I know I do from time to time. So if you're in it, how do you reverse it? How do you prevent it in the first place? Again, we're talking about thinking. Paul provides a very interesting answer. He says, next, it says, in everything by prayer and supplication, skip down to the end where he says, let your requests be made known to God. So just like be anxious is an imperative command, let your requests be made known, that little phrase is the opposite. It is the next imperative command. The way it's written here, just puts some other things in front of it. So you could flip it around if you want to. Make known your requests. Why would he say that? That's an interesting little nugget, isn't it? If you're anxious about something, it's not just pray about it. Maybe you've said that, maybe you've been told that. I'm really stressed about this thing. Just pray about it, brother. It's like, well, that's not always helpful. I can pray about it, but what does that mean? What does it mean to make your requests known to God? Why would he even say that? I think he says it because, and again, maybe this is just me, but when I'm anxious about something, I keep it to myself. Don't you? When you're anxious about something, most of the energy is spent spinning it over and over and over and over in your head and in your heart. Now, maybe you are a person who shares that anxiety out with everybody else. But even that's still the wrong direction, because it's still spinning over and over inside of you. It just happens to be spilling out into other people. But the answer, the direction it should go, is vertically. Make your requests known to God. Don't keep spinning this thing around inside of you, this false reality, walking in this false reality. And it's not just, God, take it away. That's my prayer. Because I think if you reduce it to just pray, you begin to pray for the false reality. You begin to pray about this false bubble that you've built instead of praying about what is really real. And therefore, the prayer is just sort of moot, isn't it? Anxiety, when we're in an anxiety attack or a mode or process, thinking process, the focus shifts to whatever is in the false reality, and you can't fix that. What you have to fix is your thinking. You have to fix where this energy is going. You have to redirect where this stuff is going. The only one who can do this is you, first of all, and the only one who can meet the need that is based in reality is the Lord. Now, to me, even as I'm saying this almost sounds like psychological double talk, but I think there's a lot of biblical truth to this. We have a responsibility in that we recognize I'm anxious and I'm stuck in this false world. You have to have that sort of realization, but then you have to say, okay, I need the biggest, most difficult step is saying I need to stop, isn't it? Because you're just so used to being in this place. I have to stop, and now I have to redirect my thinking to God. That's the change that needs to happen. And the only one who can do that is you. You can say, God, make me stop. He's like, I'm here for you, but you have to stop. That's what it is. We're the ones who have to take that step of actually stopping. And then he says, make our requests known to God. And as I was thinking about this, I've heard people ask this, and I had to stop and just re-examine the question for myself. Why do we need to make known to an omniscient God, a God who knows everything? Why do we have to make anything known to him? Doesn't he know it? Doesn't God know what I'm going through? Hello? Can't you just fix it? Ever prayed that? I prayed that this week at my doctor's appointment. Can't you just fix it? I mean, I have to change. I don't want to change. It is a growth opportunity. If God knows, then why doesn't he do something about it? And I was thinking about that sort of moment, and then I had this little flashback to when my kids were younger, and they would build Legos. Now, when they were younger, I don't mean like 3 or 4 years ago. I mean like 10, 12 years ago. And they had smaller fingers that were pudgier and a little less dexterous. They would be trying to either put something together or take something apart. And they would get so frustrated, and they'd have the directions out, that they would then come to me and say, Dad, can you help me take this apart? Can you help me put this together in the right way? Now, if we took the approach, why doesn't God just fix this? And in this situation say, why doesn't Dad just build this for me? That's what we're saying, right? I can't do this. Dad, you're watching me do this the whole time. Why can't you see how frustrated I'm getting? Why can't you just come in and build this whole thing for me? Well, kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? I mean, to me, this was an interesting thought, and maybe, again, I'm slow and dim, but if I did all the building, they wouldn't learn. Now, I don't just mean they wouldn't learn how to build Legos. What's, to me, is more radical and more simple is this: they wouldn't learn how to learn from me. We have to learn how to learn from other people. And if I just built the thing for them, they wouldn't learn how to take instruction from me to then go and do the thing. I think it's the same thing with us and God. Why doesn't God just fix this thing? Well, because then I wouldn't learn how to take instruction from him to make the changes that are needed, to do whatever the thing is that is done. And then I also wouldn't learn how to do what needs to be done. This is what Jesus said. This is what he came to do. In fact, he even said himself, take my yoke upon you, learn from me. We have to be able to learn how to learn from him. And then Jesus says things like, I'm not making up what I'm doing what I see the Father doing. And he had to learn how to do those things. So the reason, I think, one of the reasons God doesn't come and do and fix is because he wants us to have relationship with him. Just as I have relationship with my kids as they're building the Legos, I want them to come to me. Not because I want them to see how incompetent they are. You can't build a Lego. What's wrong with you? No, that's completely the opposite of what this heart is all about, is I want them to be able to come to me so that I can interact with them. But so that I can also teach them and see them succeed in doing the thing that I want them to do. God is the same way with us. Why doesn't he just fix it? Because then we wouldn't need to come to him in relationship at all. And he has designed us, he has built us for relationship. It's learning dependence on him in relationship, not learning to be independent and dependent on self. That's what he wants from us. So again, it's about a change in thinking. Make your requests known. Well, how do we make our requests known to God? Well, that's when we go back to the first part of the verse. In everything, by prayer and supplication. Like, isn't that kind of repetitive? Well, a little bit, but I mean, prayer is, it's a special word. It's a word that defines a time that you are going to set apart, either the time or the mental energy or the heart energy to talk to God. I'm not going to be distracted by my phone. I'm not going to be distracted by this TV show. I'm not going to be distracted by other stuff. In this moment, I'm going to pray. I'm going to dedicate this time to talk to God. And then supplication is that asking for your supplies. Supplication, supplies, right? God, I need something. Maybe if you're deep in that black hole of anxiety and you realize I'm in this hole, I don't know what I need, but I need something. I recognize that I need help. I need a rope. I need something. But God, I know that I need. And when we know that we need, we then need to go to him. Prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. That's a tough one. That can be a tough one. Because when you're in a hole and you're feeling needy, you're not feeling particularly thankful, are you? You're like, I just need stuff, God. What are you thankful for? Nothing right now because I need stuff. Anybody been there? It's like, how can I be thankful? I'm lacking stuff. Well, thanksgiving is an amazing cure for anxiety. And I think when he says, in all things with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, I think he means both telling him the things you are thankful for and coming to God in a thankful manner. I think it's both of those things. He wants us to bring our supplications, our needs to him. He also wants to know what we're thankful for, but it's also the manner in which. It's like, never been forced to pray at Thanksgiving dinner? Oh man, I gotta pray now in front of, quick, what am I thankful for? Sort of this pressure that's on. I don't know, I gotta sound good, I gotta sound right. It's like, no, with thanksgiving, there's a thankfulness that needs to be involved in this process. I guess you could say that anxiety is the opposite of thankfulness, isn't it? When you're anxious, you're not thankful. When you're thankful, you're not really anxious, are you? Now, he goes on to say in verse 7, the result is this: and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. The peace of God, if this were in Hebrew, it would say the shalom of God. That God's peace, God's goodwill, God's heart of favor toward you, God's desire for you to succeed. This is all wrapped up in this idea of shalom, God's peace, the peace of God, which by definition is a supernatural peace, isn't it? It's not a peace like, I feel okay now, I feel better. It's like, I don't know what this is, but wow. I was anxious and stressed out, and now there's a calm, there's a peace, there's a supernatural something that's taking place, which is why Paul describes it as it surpasses all understanding. It's like, I don't get where this came from, but more, please. I'll take double up. Sure. Give me some more of this. This peace of God will do, what will it do? It will guard your hearts and minds. It will stand guard. It will stand a post. That's what it'll do. It will, pick any kind of guard you want, a military guard, a prison guard, not a security guard at Walmart or something. Do they have security guards? I don't know. But somebody whose job it is to protect. This peace of God will then protect you, will guard you, will stand a watch. And it will guard both your hearts and your minds. And I'm so glad he put both. Because your heart is that sort of seat of emotion. That's where the feeling comes from, the anxiousness, the stress. And then you combine that with your mind where you're thinking through the logic, which then becomes illogical thinking of all the anxiety and the false reality that you've created. It will guard those things. It will protect those things. Now, Paul is not saying that we need to live in a world and exist in such a way that we're going, la, 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 nothing's ever wrong. I'm totally fine. I'm very thankful, la, la, la. It's not what he's saying. He doesn't want us to live in this, obscured world. He just says, as you are going through stuff, this is how to live. This is how to protect yourself from the thinking processes that will drag you down. And then he sort of expands on it in verse 8. Finally, or in conclusion, brethren and sisterin, and he gives this great little list. Whatever things are true. Well, let me tell you what we're supposed to do with the list first. At the very end is the command. Meditate on these things. Chew on these things. This list of things, give the bulk of your attention to these things. Another way to ask or talk about this is, what are you feeding? This sounds, I have animals, I love animals, and this sounds cruel if you're especially a lover of animals. But if you were to get a pet and you stopped feeding it, what would happen to that pet? It would die. What do you have to do? You have to feed it. You have to water it. You have to love it, and you have to pet it and call it George. And you have to feed it. What are you feeding? Meditate on these things. Feed on these things. Because if you're not feeding the stuff that needs to be fed, it's going to starve and die. Sometimes I just feel so weak. Well, are you feeding that part in you? Well, no. Duh. Corby, your cholesterol is 1,015 million billion points. Oh, I guess I'm feeding it too much. I need to feed the right stuff in to make it better. What are you feeding? I was trying to help somebody through some stuff one time, and I asked them, so what? They had a particular job where they had a lot of freedom to listen to stuff on headphones. I said, well, what do you listen to most of the day? And they said, talk radio. It's like, oh, no wonder you're so anxious about everything, because whether it's conservative or liberal talk radio, I don't care. They feed you stress. They feed you conflict. They feed you division. They feed you garbage. And if that is what a person is meditating on, of course they're going to be anxious. What are you meditating on? Here's Paul's recommended list of things to meditate, to chew on. Whatever things are true, not like true as opposed to false, but like, right. Whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things that are righteous, in other terms, whatever things are pure. In other words, things that are clean. What kinds of things are you putting in your head? Are you putting clean or unclean, pure or impure things? Whatever things are lovely, which might, to the more masculine in the room might sound a little effeminate, but it's like whatever things are gracious would be another word to use. Things that have a grace about them, something that's beautiful, something that is has that aspect to it. Whatever things are of good report. I mean, it's good to be kept up on current events. And there's all kinds of things happening in the world that we need to know about and that we need to be praying for and praying about. But we also need to hear the good reports so that there's at least a little bit of balance, if not more so. I know might be in a conversation with somebody and say, I know there's a lot of bad things, but let me share you some of the good reports that are happening in the world. Let me share you some of the positive things that are happening. If there's any virtue, we talked about virtue last week. It was sort of that, it's not just, we called it moral energy. It's not just a virtuous thing, but it's also the strength that is behind the thing in order to do the thing, right? So whatever is of any virtue has that good, positive, moral mojo to it. And if there's anything praiseworthy, which connects back to Thanksgiving, meditate on these things. Now, again, that doesn't mean we live in a la world. It means, where are you spending most of your mental energy? Where is your thought life? What are you feeding into these things? And, contrary to popular belief, I'm always thinking. You're always thinking. We're always thinking about something. We're always taking in something that's feeding what it is we're thinking. It's always happening, which might sound like a big thing, but I've sort of classified it as a little thing because it's always present. We don't even necessarily think about what we're thinking about, but we need to start doing that if you haven't already. It seems like a little thing, but it's a huge thing, and it will affect your relationships, it'll affect your job, it'll affect everything. Paul says things like, put on the mind of Christ. If that doesn't communicate a change of thinking, I don't know what does. Paul says things like taking every thought captive. And I was thinking about this with a friend of mine because they were kind of confused about that phrase. And I thought, well, I'm kind of confused about it too because I think very literally often. And when I hear the phrase take it captive, for some reason my brain goes back to old England, King Arthur sort of time where maybe a knight has gone out to capture a bad guy and brought him before the king as a captive, saying, here he is, my lord, may justice be done upon him. And maybe that's that little role play, maybe that's what has to happen for you. If a thought process begins, something that starts that obsession sort of snowball, grab that thought, and maybe in your mind, if you have to imagine this, taking that thought captive, literally in handcuffs or tied up or bound up before the throne of God and saying, here, my king, is this bad guy, may justice be done upon him. Take it captive before it is allowed to run free and do its naughtiness in your life. There's a lot to do in this book with our minds and our thinking. And if you are a person, like I hope you are, like I want to be, who wants to think like Jesus and who wants to be like Jesus, then I need to be deliberate about that. Then I need to be proactive about that as opposed to reactive about it. I need to do something more than just Sundays at church. And it's not about the thing you do, it's about being, isn't it? It's about being. It's not so much about doing, because if you are the thing, then you will do what comes naturally. If you want to be on mission, you got to fill your head and your heart with Jesus stuff, and then you will naturally be on mission. You will naturally, deliberately live out like Jesus. I've said before, I don't know that we need more Bible studies as individual events. There's nothing wrong with Bible studies. I'm pretty into this book, right? But how much more do we need to learn before we go and do? We could learn this thing forwards and backwards. We could learn all the theology and all the facts and but it doesn't mean anything unless we're actually doing it. And it's not, again, I'm not trying to encourage you to do, I'm trying to encourage you and myself to get so into Jesus that he just oozes out of you. Maybe not even oozes, maybe just pours out of you like a flood. In fact, Jesus himself said, I'm going to a well of living water coming out of you. And it comes back to our thinking. So I'm not going to give you a list of things to do about your own thinking. Maybe just a list of suggestions. Again, what do you watch on television? What do you watch on movies? What do you listen to in the car? Or maybe when you're out on a run, where are you feeding yourself? Because apparently, how did that little phrase go? If you eat fat, greasy food, you will become a fat, greasy dude. You are what you eat. It's that simple. Garbage in, garbage out. Goodness in, goodness out. And it is that simple. It's like, man, I want to be like Jesus. So how are you feeding that? What are you doing with that?